The pregnant mare lay dying at Eleanor's door, her breath fading into the blizzard while her swollen belly still moved with unborn life. What she delivered 3 days later made the 73-year-old widow fall to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Minnesota plains that December evening, carrying with it a fury of snow that seemed determined to bury everything in its path. Eleanor Mitchell, a 73-year-old widow who had lived alone on her small farm for the past 8 years since her husband Harold passed, stood at her kitchen window watching the blizzard intensify. The weathered farmhouse creaked and groaned under the assault, but Eleanor had seen worse storms in her lifetime. What she had never seen, however, was what would appear at her door that night, changing her life in ways she could never have imagined. Eleanor had just finished her simple dinner of soup and bread when she heard something that made her pause mid-step on her way to the sink. It was a sound unlike the wind, unlike the rattling shutters or the groaning timbers. It was a thud, heavy and deliberate, followed by what sounded almost like a cry. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination playing tricks, as the isolation of winter nights often did to those who lived alone. But then it came again, louder this time, accompanied by a scraping sound against her front door. Her heart quickened as she set down her dishes and made her way through the dimly lit hallway. At her age, unexpected visitors were rare, and in weather like this, they were virtually unheard of. She pulled her thick-knitted shawl tighter around her shoulders, the one she had made herself during the long winter months after Harold's passing, and approached the door with cautious steps. When she opened it, the blast of cold air nearly knocked her backward, but it was what lay before her that truly took her breath away. There, collapsed on her snow-covered porch, was a horse. Not just any horse, but a beautiful cream-colored mare with a coat that seemed to glow even in the dim light of the storm. The animal was lying on her side, her breathing labored and visible in great clouds of white vapor that disappeared into the swirling snow. But what struck Eleanor most was the mare's belly, swollen and round with the unmistakable signs of advanced pregnancy. The creature had somehow found her way through the blizzard, through miles of frozen wilderness, to collapse at the doorstep of a lonely old woman who had almost forgotten what it felt like to be needed. For a moment, Eleanor stood frozen, her mind racing through possibilities. Where had this horse come from? Who did she belong to? How had she survived the journey through such treacherous conditions? But as she watched the mare struggle to lift her head, those dark eyes meeting hers with a mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope, Eleanor knew that the answers to those questions could wait. What mattered now was getting this creature out of the cold before it was too late for both her and the life she carried within. Moving with a strength and determination that surprised even herself, Eleanor stepped out into the biting wind and knelt beside the fallen mare. The snow immediately soaked through her house dress and the cold bit into her aging joints, but she paid it no mind. She placed her weathered hand on the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of life still pulsing beneath the damp coat. The mare flinched at first, then seemed to relax under Eleanor's gentle touch, as if recognizing something in the old woman's presence that told her she was finally safe. Getting the horse to stand was no easy task. Eleanor spoke to her in soft, soothing tones, words that came from somewhere deep within her memory, words she had used decades ago when she and Harold had kept horses of their own before time and circumstance had taken them away. She coaxed and encouraged, pushed and pulled until finally, with a tremendous effort, the mare rose unsteadily to her feet. Together, step by agonizing step, they made their way around the house toward the old barn that had stood empty for years. The barn door protested loudly as Eleanor forced it open, the hinges stiff from disuse. Inside, the air was cold but still, protected from the relentless wind. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, casting silver stripes across the dusty floor. Eleanor guided the mare to the corner where hay still remained from years past, miraculously preserved by the dry cold of Minnesota winters. She worked quickly, spreading fresh straw to create a bed, her old body protesting with every movement, but her spirit refusing to acknowledge the pain. Once the mare was settled, Eleanor hurried back to the house, returning moments later with blankets, warm water, and a lantern that cast a warm golden glow throughout the space. She draped the blankets over the shivering horse, offering her water, which the mare drank gratefully. As Eleanor worked, she found herself talking to the animal as if she were an old friend, sharing thoughts and feelings she had kept locked away for years in the silence of her solitary existence. That night, Eleanor did not sleep in her bed. Instead, she sat beside the mare on an old wooden stool, her hand resting on the horse's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. The blizzard raged outside, but within the barn a fragile peace had settled. Eleanor watched the mare's belly rise and fall, occasionally seeing movement beneath the taut skin, evidence of the new life that would soon make its appearance. She did not know then that this unexpected visitor would bring her more than just company through the storm. She did not know that in 3 days' time she would witness something that would move her to tears and remind her of the profound mysteries of life and love. All she knew in that moment was that fate had brought this creature to her door, and she would do everything in her power to help her. As the hours passed and the storm began to weaken, Eleanor made a silent promise to the mare whose name she did not yet know. She would see her through this, whatever it took. In the quiet of that old barn, surrounded by the ghosts of memories and the warmth of the lantern's glow, two souls found each other in the darkness, each one desperately needing what the other had to give. The morning after the blizzard arrived with a stillness that seemed almost sacred. Eleanor woke with a start, momentarily disoriented to find herself not in her bedroom, but slumped against the rough wooden wall of the barn. Every muscle in her body ached from the uncomfortable position, and her joints protested loudly as she slowly straightened herself. But the moment her eyes found the mare, still resting in the bed of straw, still breathing, still alive, all thoughts of her own discomfort vanished. The horse lifted her head at the sound of Eleanor's movement, those deep brown eyes finding the old woman's face with what could only be described as recognition and gratitude. The world outside had been transformed overnight. Where yesterday there had been a landscape of browns and grays, now everything lay buried beneath a pristine blanket of white that sparkled in the early morning sunlight. The snow had drifted against the barn walls in great sculptured waves, and Eleanor knew that it would be days before she could expect any help from town. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and at her age, attempting the journey through waist-deep snow would be foolish at best and fatal at worst. No, she and the mare would have to manage on their own, at least for now. Eleanor had not cared for a horse in nearly 15 years, not since their last mare, Ginger, had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the ripe old age of 28. Harold had wanted to get another horse after that, but Eleanor had convinced him that they were getting too old for such responsibilities. Now, as she gathered supplies and prepared to tend to her unexpected guest, she found that the old knowledge came back to her like muscle memory, rising from somewhere deep within where it had lain dormant all these years. She examined the mare carefully in the light of day, running her hands along the horse's body with practiced gentleness. The animal was thin, too thin for a horse so close to foaling, and her coat, though beautiful in its creamy paleness, showed signs of neglect. There were small cuts and scrapes along her legs, likely from pushing through brush and brambles during her desperate journey. Her hooves were cracked and worn, evidence of miles traveled without proper care. But despite all of this, there was a nobility to the mare, a quiet dignity in the way she held her head and the intelligence that shone in her eyes. Who had abandoned such a magnificent creature? The question burned in Eleanor's mind as she worked, cleaning the wounds with warm water and applying the antiseptic salve she had found in her old first aid kit. She could not imagine anyone willfully casting aside a pregnant horse to fend for herself in the wilderness, yet here was the evidence lying before her. Perhaps the mare had escaped from somewhere, had broken free and wandered until exhaustion and the storm had driven her to Eleanor's door. Or perhaps, Eleanor thought with a growing anger that surprised her with its intensity, someone had simply decided that a pregnant mare was too much trouble and had turned her out to face whatever fate awaited her. The mare, whom Eleanor had begun calling Grace in her mind for the elegant way she moved even in her weakened state, seemed to understand that she was being helped. She stood patiently while Eleanor tended to her wounds, only occasionally shifting her weight or flicking her ears at some sound from outside. When Eleanor offered her a bucket of warm water mixed with a handful of the old grain she had found in a forgotten corner of the barn, Grace drank and ate with evident relief, her large tongue lapping up every last drop and morsel. Throughout that first full day, Eleanor divided her time between the barn and the house, making countless trips through the snow to bring supplies, food, and fresh water to her charge. She had forgotten how much work caring for a horse could be, especially one in such a delicate condition. But she had also forgotten how fulfilling it felt, how the simple act of caring for another living being could fill the empty spaces that had grown so large within her over the years of solitude. Each time she entered the barn and Grace lifted her head to greet her, Eleanor felt something stir in her chest that she had thought long dead. As the day wore on, Eleanor began talking to Grace in earnest, sharing her thoughts and memories as if the mare could understand every word. She told her about Harold, about how they had met at a church social when she was just 18, and he was a young farmer with big dreams and calloused hands. She told her about their life together, the struggles and joys, the children who had grown and moved away to cities far from this quiet corner of Minnesota. She told her about the grandchildren she rarely saw, about the loneliness that had become her constant companion, about the way the silence of the empty house sometimes felt like it might swallow her whole. Grace listened with those patient eyes, her ears turning toward Eleanor's voice, occasionally offering a soft nicker that Eleanor chose to interpret as understanding and sympathy. It had been so long since Eleanor had spoken this much, since she had unburdened herself to anyone, that the words seemed to pour out of her like water from a dam that had finally broken. And in the quiet of the barn, with the snow glittering outside and the lantern casting its warm glow, Eleanor felt a connection forming between herself and this wounded creature that defied explanation. That night, as she had the night before, Eleanor stayed in the barn with Grace. She had brought more blankets this time, creating a makeshift bed for herself near the mare's side. As she lay there in the darkness, listening to Grace's steady breathing, Eleanor found herself wondering about the life growing inside the horse. Was it a colt or a filly? Would it be healthy after all its mother had been through? Would they both survive the birth when it came? These questions circled in her mind as sleep slowly claimed her, mixing with dreams of years gone by and hopes she had forgotten she still harbored. The second day brought more of the same, a rhythm of care and conversation that began to feel natural and right. Eleanor cleaned the barn as best she could, making the space more comfortable for Grace and the birth that was surely approaching. She noticed that the mare's movements had become more restless, her breathing occasionally quickening for no apparent reason. Eleanor recognized these signs from her years of experience, knowing that the time was drawing near. She prayed silently that when the moment came, she would have the strength and knowledge to help, that this gift that had appeared at her door would not be taken from her before she could fully understand why it had come. By the third morning, Eleanor knew that something had changed. She had woken before dawn, pulled from sleep by a sound she could not immediately identify. It was Grace, and the mare was no longer lying peacefully in her bed of straw. Instead, she was standing, shifting her weight from one leg to another, her head turning repeatedly to look at her swollen belly. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and when Eleanor approached, she could see the muscles along the horse's flanks, rippling with contractions that came and went like waves upon a shore. The time had come. Eleanor felt a surge of fear mixed with determination as she realized what was happening. She had helped with foalings before, many years ago when she and Harold had raised horses as part of their livelihood. But that had been decades past, and she had been younger then, stronger, with her husband by her side to share the burden. Now she was alone, an old woman with aching bones and trembling hands facing the responsibility of bringing new life into the world with no one to help her if something went wrong. But there was no time for doubt, no luxury of hesitation. Grace needed her, and Eleanor would not fail her now, not after everything they had been through together in these short days. She moved quickly, gathering the supplies she had prepared in anticipation of this moment. Clean towels, warm water, the old veterinary kit that Harold had kept stocked for emergencies. She spread fresh straw around the area where Grace stood, creating a soft landing for the foal that would soon make its entrance into the world. Grace's labor progressed slowly at first, each contraction bringing a soft groan from the mare and a tightening of her muscles that Eleanor could see rippling beneath the pale coat. Eleanor stayed close, speaking in that calm, steady voice that seemed to comfort the horse, her hand resting on Grace's neck to let her know she was not alone. The morning light grew stronger, filtering through the gaps in the barn walls, painting stripes of gold across the scene that was unfolding in that quiet, sacred space. As the hours passed, Eleanor found herself praying, something she had not done with any real conviction since Harold's funeral. She prayed for Grace, for the foal, for the strength to see this through. She prayed for guidance, for steady hands and clear thinking. And somewhere in those prayers she found herself thanking God for sending this creature to her, for giving her a purpose again after so many years of merely existing. Whatever happened in the next hours, she knew that her life had already been changed by this experience, that something had awakened within her that she had thought forever lost. The contractions grew stronger and closer together as midday approached. Grace had lowered herself to the straw, her body instinctively preparing for the final stage of labor. Eleanor positioned herself where she could see and assist if needed, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety. She had witnessed many births in her lifetime, but each one felt like a miracle, a moment when the veil between worlds seemed to thin and something divine touched the ordinary fabric of existence. Then, with a contraction more powerful than any that had come before, Eleanor saw the first sign of the foal emerging. The tiny hooves appeared, wrapped in the membrane of the birth sac, followed by the delicate legs that seemed impossibly fragile. Eleanor held her breath as Grace pushed again, the mare's whole body straining with the effort of bringing her offspring into the world. More of the foal became visible, the small head tucked between the forelegs exactly as it should be, and Eleanor felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. With one final tremendous push, the foal slid free onto the waiting straw. Eleanor moved immediately, clearing the membrane from the tiny face, making sure the nostrils were clear so the newborn could take its first breath. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The foal lay motionless, and Eleanor felt the cold grip of fear clutching at her chest. But then, like the answer to every prayer she had whispered that morning, the small body shuddered, the chest expanded, and a breath of life filled those new lungs for the very first time. But Eleanor's relief was short-lived, for Grace's labor was not over. The mare's body continued to contract, and Eleanor watched in amazement as another set of tiny hooves began to appear. Twins. In all her years of helping with horses, Eleanor had never witnessed a twin birth. She knew they were rare, knew they were dangerous, knew that the odds of both foals surviving were slim at best. But she also knew that she would fight for these lives with everything she had, that she would not give up on them any more than she had given up on their mother. The second foal came more quickly than the first, as if eager to join its sibling in this new world. Eleanor repeated her ministrations, clearing the membrane, checking the breathing, making sure this tiny life had the best possible chance of survival. When she finally sat back on her heels, her hands shaking and her heart racing, two newborn foals lay in the straw beside their exhausted mother. Both were breathing, both were alive, and Eleanor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred, felt the tears she had been holding back finally break free. She wept then, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She wept for the miracle she had just witnessed, for the lives she had helped bring into being. She wept for Harold, who would have loved to see this moment, who would have been right beside her through every contraction and every push. She wept for all the lonely years, for the grandchildren she missed, for the purpose she had thought was lost forever. And she wept with gratitude, deep and profound, for the pregnant Mare who had somehow found her way through a blizzard to collapse at the door of a woman who needed her just as desperately as she needed help. Grace lifted her head and looked at Eleanor, those dark eyes holding something that went beyond animal instinct. Then, with the ancient wisdom of motherhood, the Mare turned her attention to her foals, beginning the gentle process of cleaning them and urging them to their feet. And Eleanor, wiping her tears with the back of her trembling hand, watched in wonder as new life took its first tentative steps into a world that had suddenly become beautiful again. The hours that followed the birth passed in a blur of activity and wonder. Eleanor worked tirelessly, moving between Grace and the two foals with an energy that belied her 73 years. The twin foals, one slightly larger than the other, were both the same creamy color as their mother, though their coats were still damp and curly from birth. The larger one, which Eleanor could see was a colt, had a small white star on his forehead that reminded her of the North Star that had guided travelers for centuries. The smaller one, a filly, had 4 white socks that made her look as if she were wearing little boots. Eleanor found herself smiling at the sight, a genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on her face after so long. Getting the foals to nurse was the first critical challenge. Eleanor knew that newborn horses needed to drink their mother's first milk within the first few hours of life, as it contained vital nutrients and antibodies that would help them survive. The colt, stronger and more coordinated, found his way to Grace's side relatively quickly, his wobbly legs somehow carrying him to the source of nourishment he instinctively sought. But the filly struggled, her smaller body seemingly overwhelmed by the effort of simply standing, let alone walking. Eleanor's heart ached as she watched the tiny creature fall again and again, each attempt ending with her crumpled in the straw, her large eyes blinking with confusion and exhaustion. Grace nickered softly, encouraging her daughter, but the mare was too exhausted from labor to do more than offer vocal support. It fell to Eleanor to help, and so she did, positioning herself behind the filly and supporting her weight as she guided her toward her mother's side. It took nearly an hour of patient effort, of lifting and steadying and encouraging, before the filly finally latched on and began to nurse. The relief Eleanor felt in that moment was indescribable. She sank down onto the straw beside Grace, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion that had been building since the blizzard first brought the mare to her door. Her muscles screamed for rest, her joints throbbed with the familiar pain of arthritis aggravated by cold and exertion, but her spirit soared with a joy she had not felt in years. She had done it. Against all odds, alone in her barn in the aftermath of a blizzard, she had helped bring 2 new lives into the world. As the foals nursed and Grace rested, Eleanor allowed herself to truly look at the scene before her. The golden light of the lantern mixed with the pale afternoon sun filtering through the barn walls, creating an almost ethereal glow around the small family. Grace lay with her head turned toward her offspring, watching them with the fierce tenderness that only a mother could possess. The foals, their bellies now full, had settled into the straw on either side of their mother, their tiny bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. It was, Eleanor thought, one of the most beautiful things she had ever witnessed. She found herself thinking of her own children, of the moments after their births when she had held them for the first time and felt that overwhelming rush of love that seemed to redefine everything she thought she knew about the world. Her daughter Sarah had been born on a night much like this, cold and snowy, with Harold pacing in the waiting room, while Eleanor labored in a small hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and hope. Her son Michael had come in the spring, arriving so quickly that Harold had barely made it back from the fields in time to witness his entrance into the world. Where were they now? Her children? Sarah lived in Seattle, caught up in her career and her own family, too busy to call more than once a month and too far away to visit more than once a year. Michael had settled in Florida, escaping the Minnesota winters that had defined his childhood, building a life that seemed to have no room for his aging mother. Eleanor did not blame them for their absence. She understood that life moved forward, that children grew and left and built their own worlds. But understanding did not ease the loneliness, did not fill the empty rooms of her farmhouse or warm the cold side of her bed where Harold used to sleep. But now, sitting in this barn surrounded by new life, Eleanor felt something shift within her. The loneliness was still there, would perhaps always be there, but it no longer seemed quite so overwhelming. Grace and her foals had given her something precious, something she had not realized she was missing until it was suddenly present. They had given her purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, a life beyond her own to care for and nurture and love. As the afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor made herself get up and attend to the practical matters that could not be ignored. She brought more water for Grace, who drank deeply, her body working to replenish what had been lost during the birth. She checked on the foals, making sure they were warm enough, their tiny bodies still vulnerable to the cold that crept through the barn walls. She brought fresh hay and spread it around the small family, creating an insulated nest that would protect them through the night. Before returning to the house to prepare her own meager dinner, Eleanor stood for a long moment at the barn door, looking back at the scene she was leaving. Grace had raised her head and was watching her, those intelligent eyes seeming to communicate something that went beyond the boundaries of species and language. In that gaze, Eleanor saw gratitude and trust, the recognition of one mother to another, the acknowledgement of a bond that had formed in the crucible of shared struggle and triumph. Sleep would not come easily that night, Eleanor knew. Her mind was too full, her heart too stirred by everything that had happened. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the sleeplessness would not be born of loneliness or grief. Tonight she would lie awake thinking of the future, of the days and weeks and months ahead, of watching those two foals grow strong and healthy under her care. Tonight, for the first time in years, Eleanor Mitchell had something to look forward to, and that simple fact felt like the greatest gift she had ever received. The days that followed the birth settled into a rhythm that Eleanor found deeply comforting. Each morning she woke before dawn and made her way to the barn, her breath forming clouds in the cold air as she trudged through the snow that still lay thick upon the ground. Each morning, Grace greeted her with a soft nicker, and the foals, growing stronger by the hour, would lift their heads from where they lay, nestled against their mother's warm body. And each morning, Eleanor felt that same surge of gratitude and wonder that had filled her heart the moment she first saw those tiny creatures take their first breaths. She had named the foals on the second day after their birth, feeling that such remarkable beings deserved names that honored their miraculous arrival. The colt, with his white star and his bold, curious nature, she called Shepherd, for the star that had guided wise men and weary travelers alike. The filly, smaller and more delicate with her 4 white socks and her gentle spirit, she named Hope, for that was what she had brought back into Eleanor's life. Together with their mother Grace, they formed a family unit that Eleanor found herself growing more attached to with each passing hour. The snow began to melt slowly as the days warmed, though winter still held the land firmly in its grip. Eleanor knew that soon the roads would be passable again, that contact with the outside world would resume, and that questions would need to be answered about the mysterious mare who had appeared at her door. She had searched Grace thoroughly for any identifying marks, any brand or tattoo that might indicate where she had come from, but had found nothing. The mare remained a mystery, her past as unknowable as the future that lay ahead. Eleanor's nearest neighbor was Frank Peterson, a widower in his 60s who ran a small cattle operation about 3 miles down the road. He had been a friend to both Eleanor and Harold for decades, and after Harold's passing, he had made a point of checking in on Eleanor regularly, helping with repairs she could not manage alone and providing company during the long winter months. It was Frank who first appeared at her door once the roads became navigable, his weathered face creased with concern as he asked if she had weathered the storm without incident. The look on his face when Eleanor led him to the barn and showed him Grace and the twins was something she would treasure for the rest of her days. Frank stood in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, his eyes moving from the mare to the foals to Eleanor and back again, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. When he finally found his voice, it came out rough with emotion, and Eleanor saw him quickly wipe at his eyes with the back of his gloved hand. He told her that he had heard nothing about a missing pregnant mare, that no one in the surrounding counties had reported losing such an animal. He promised to make inquiries, to spread the word, and see if anyone came forward to claim her. But as he spoke, Eleanor saw something in his eyes that mirrored her own feelings, a hope that no one would come, that this gift that had been bestowed upon her would not be taken away. Frank understood, perhaps better than anyone, how much Eleanor needed something to care for, how the emptiness of her life had been slowly consuming her since Harold's death. Word spread quickly through the small community, as it always did in rural places where everyone knew everyone else's business. Within days, a steady stream of visitors began appearing at Eleanor's farm, curious neighbors and old friends who wanted to see the miracle mare and her twin foals for themselves. They brought casseroles and baked goods, bags of grain and bales of hay, offering their support in the practical ways that country folk had perfected over generations of helping one another through hard times. Among the visitors was Dr. Sarah Chen, the local veterinarian who had taken over the practice from old Doc Williams when he retired 5 years earlier. She was young and energetic, with a gentle manner that immediately put both animals and their owners at ease. She examined Grace and the foals thoroughly, pronouncing them all in remarkably good health considering the circumstances of their arrival. The mare, she estimated, was about 8 years old, well-bred and well-trained, despite the neglect she had clearly suffered before finding her way to Eleanor's door. Dr. Chen marveled at the twin foals, explaining to Eleanor just how rare and dangerous twin births were in horses. Most twin pregnancies ended in loss, she said, either through early miscarriage or complications during birth that claimed one or both foals. For both Shepherd and Hope to have survived, and to be thriving as they clearly were, was nothing short of extraordinary. She credited Eleanor's care during those critical first hours, her instincts and experience that had guided her through the delivery when professional help was miles away and unreachable. Eleanor accepted the praise with humble grace, though in her heart she knew that she deserved only part of the credit. Grace had done the hard work, had carried those foals through whatever hardships she had endured before finding refuge, had delivered them with the strength and determination that only a mother could summon. And something else had been at work that night, something Eleanor could not name but could feel as surely as she felt the cold wind on her face or the warmth of the foal's breath against her palm. Providence, perhaps. Fate. The hand of God reaching down to weave together two lives that needed each other. As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor found herself transformed by the presence of her equine family. She who had barely eaten enough to sustain herself now prepared proper meals so she would have the energy to care for her charges. She who had stopped bothering to dress properly now rose each morning with purpose, pulling on her warm clothes and heading out to greet the day. She who had gone days without speaking to another living soul now talked constantly, sharing her thoughts and feelings with Grace as she had done from the very first night, and now including the foals in her one-sided conversations as well. The change did not go unnoticed by those who knew her. Frank commented on it during one of his visits, telling Eleanor that she looked 10 years younger than she had before the blizzard. Her daughter Sarah, calling for her weekly check-in, remarked that her mother sounded different, more alive somehow. Even the mail carrier, who had grown accustomed to Eleanor's brief and subdued interactions, noticed the sparkle that had returned to the old woman's eyes. Winter slowly released its grip on the Minnesota landscape as February gave way to March. The snow receded in patches, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the days grew incrementally longer, offering more light for Eleanor to spend with her beloved horses. Shepherd and Hope had grown remarkably in the weeks since their birth, their wobbly legs now sturdy and strong, their curious natures leading them to explore every corner of the barn and the small paddock that Eleanor had cleared for them. Grace watched over her offspring with patient vigilance, never straying far from their sides, her cream-colored coat beginning to regain the luster that neglect had stolen from it. Eleanor had fallen into a routine that brought structure and meaning to days that had once stretched empty before her. Mornings were for feeding and cleaning, for checking hooves and coats, and making sure all 3 horses were healthy and comfortable. Afternoons were for grooming and gentle training, for teaching the foals to accept a halter and lead rope, for building the trust that would serve them well throughout their lives. Evenings were for sitting in the barn with a cup of tea, watching the small family settle in for the night, feeling a peace that Eleanor had thought she would never know again. It was on a gray afternoon in mid-March that the peace was first threatened. Eleanor was in the barn, brushing Hope's soft coat while Shepherd nuzzled at her pockets looking for the treats he had learned she often carried, when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. This was not unusual anymore, as visitors had become a regular occurrence since word of the miracle foals had spread, but something about the engine's sound, aggressive and impatient, made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. She stepped out of the barn to see a large black truck pulling into her yard, its oversized tires churning up mud as it came to an abrupt stop. 2 men emerged, one tall and thin with sharp features and restless eyes, the other shorter and stockier with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of displeasure. They wore expensive boots and clean jackets, city clothes that looked out of place against the backdrop of Eleanor's humble farm. The tall one's gaze swept across the property with an appraising look that made Eleanor's skin prickle with instinctive distrust. The tall man spoke first, his voice carrying the flat tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He introduced himself as Marcus Webb and his companion as his associate Dale. They were looking, he explained, for a horse that had gone missing from a property about 60 miles south. A cream-colored mare, pregnant when she disappeared, worth a considerable amount of money. They had heard rumors that such a horse had turned up in this area, and they were prepared to pay a finder's fee for her return. Eleanor felt her heart constrict as she listened to the man's words. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment might come. She had prayed that it would not, that Grace would remain unclaimed, that the life they had built together would be allowed to continue undisturbed. But here was reality, standing in her muddy yard, demanding what it considered its rightful property. She chose her words carefully, years of experience having taught her the value of caution when dealing with strangers whose intentions were unclear. Yes, she acknowledged, a mare matching that description had come to her farm during the blizzard. The horse had been in poor condition, clearly neglected, and heavily pregnant. She had cared for the animal, had helped deliver twin foals, had nursed all 3 back to health. She asked, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside, how the mare had come to be wandering alone in such dangerous weather. Marcus Webb's expression flickered, a brief shadow passing across his features before he composed himself. The horse had escaped, he explained smoothly. A gate had been left open, an unfortunate accident. They had searched for her, but the blizzard had made tracking impossible. He was grateful, truly grateful, that such a kind soul had taken her in. But now it was time for the Mare to come home. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded paper, which he held out toward Eleanor, with the confidence of a man who believed that documents could settle any dispute. Eleanor did not take the paper. Instead, she looked past the two men toward the barn, where Grace had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unfamiliar voices. The Mare's ears were flat against her head, her body tense with a fear that Eleanor had not seen since those first desperate hours after the blizzard. Behind Grace, she could see Shepherd and Hope, their young faces peering out with the innocent curiosity of creatures who had not yet learned to recognize danger. The sight of Grace's fear told Eleanor everything she needed to know about these men and their claims of ownership. Animals did not lie, did not dissemble, did not hide their true feelings behind polished words and legal documents. Grace remembered these men, or men like them, and what she remembered filled her with terror. Eleanor felt something harden within her, a resolve that surprised her with its intensity. She had not fought to save this horse and her foals only to hand them over to those who had caused them such harm. She told the men that she would need to see more proof than a piece of paper. She told them that in her experience, horses did not escape from places where they were well treated. She told them that Grace and her foals were under a veterinarian's care, and that any transfer of ownership would need to go through proper legal channels. Her voice did not waver as she spoke, though inside she was quaking with fear and anger, and a fierce protectiveness that she had not felt since her own children were small. Marcus Webb's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Eleanor saw something dangerous lurking behind his polished facade. But then he smiled, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes, and told her that of course he understood her caution. He would return with the proper documentation, he assured her. He would involve the authorities if necessary. That horse belonged to his employer, and one way or another, she would be reclaimed. He turned and walked back to the truck, his associate following in silence, and moments later the vehicle roared away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the yard with her heart pounding against her ribs. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat in the old rocking chair by her bedroom window, staring out at the darkness where she knew the barn stood, where Grace and the foals were resting unaware of the threat that had materialized against them. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one more troubling than the last. She had no money for lawyers, no powerful friends who could intervene on her behalf. She was just an old woman alone on a farm, standing against men who clearly had resources and were accustomed to getting what they wanted. But as the hours passed and the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, Eleanor felt her fears slowly transform into something else. Determination, defiance, a stubborn refusal to surrender that had carried her through every hardship she had ever faced. She had survived the loss of her parents when she was barely 20. She had survived the difficult years when the farm teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. She had survived Harold's death, the hardest blow of all. She would survive this too, and so would Grace and Shepherd and Hope. The first thing she did that morning was call Frank Peterson. She told him everything, her voice steady despite the sleepless night, and asked for his advice. Frank listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He told her that he knew a lawyer in town, a young woman named Rebecca Torres, who had grown up on a farm herself and had a reputation for helping those who could not afford expensive legal help. He would call her that very morning, he promised, and explain the situation. True to his word, Frank called back within the hour with news that Rebecca would come to the farm that afternoon to discuss Eleanor's options. Eleanor spent the intervening hours in the barn with her horses, finding comfort in their presence as she always did. She brushed Grace's coat until it gleamed, fed treats to Shepherd and Hope, and talked to them all in that soft voice that had become as natural to her as breathing. She told them not to worry, that she would protect them, that no one would take them away from her as long as she had breath in her body. Rebecca Torres arrived in a modest sedan that had seen better days, her appearance as unpretentious as her vehicle. She was in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She shook Eleanor's hand with a firm grip and accepted the offer of coffee, settling into a chair at the kitchen table as if she had been there many times before. There was something about her manner that put Eleanor at ease, a groundedness that spoke of someone who understood the rhythms of rural life. Eleanor told her story from the beginning, from the night of the blizzard to the visit from Marcus Webb and his associate. Rebecca listened attentively, asking occasional questions to clarify details, taking notes in a small leather journal she had produced from her bag. When Eleanor finished, Rebecca sat back and considered for a moment before speaking. The situation, she acknowledged, was complicated. If these men could prove legal ownership of Grace, they might have grounds to reclaim her. But there were factors working in Eleanor's favor that could not be ignored. First, there was the matter of abandonment. Minnesota law had provisions for animals that were found abandoned or neglected, and the condition Grace had been in when she arrived at Eleanor's door suggested that she had not been receiving proper care. Second, there was the question of the foals. Shepherd and Hope had been born on Eleanor's property, had been cared for exclusively by Eleanor, and their existence raised questions about whether any claim to Grace automatically extended to her offspring. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was time. Eleanor had now been caring for these horses for over a month, investing resources and labor into their well-being. That counted for something in the eyes of the law. Rebecca promised to do some research into Marcus Webb and his employer to find out who exactly was making this claim and what their history with animals might reveal. She advised Eleanor to document everything, to take photographs of the horses and their living conditions, to keep records of all the expenses she had incurred in their care. She told Eleanor not to speak to Webb or anyone else about the matter without consulting her first. And she assured Eleanor that she would not face this battle alone, that there were people in this community who would stand with her against those who mistreated animals and then demanded their return as if they were nothing more than misplaced property. After Rebecca left, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not fully realized she was carrying. She was still afraid, still uncertain of what the coming days would bring, but she no longer felt quite so alone in her fear. She had allies now, people who believed in her cause and were willing to fight alongside her. That knowledge made all the difference. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Eleanor went about her routines, caring for the horses, maintaining the farm, but always with one eye on the road, waiting for the black truck to reappear. Frank came by daily, finding excuses to check on things, his presence a reassurance that Eleanor appreciated more than she could express. Other neighbors stopped by too, word having spread through the community about the men who had come claiming the miracle mare. There was a closing of ranks, a circling of wagons, that reminded Eleanor of why she had chosen to spend her life in this place among these people. Rebecca called on the fourth day with news that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She had discovered that Marcus Webb worked for a man named Victor Hendricks, a wealthy businessman from the Twin Cities, who had recently gotten into horse breeding as a hobby. Hendricks had a reputation for impatience and ruthlessness, for viewing animals as investments rather than living beings. Several horses from his operation had been quietly sold or disposed of when they failed to meet his expectations. Grace, Rebecca suspected, had been one of these discards, turned loose when her pregnancy made her useless for the racing career Hendricks had envisioned. But here was the crucial detail that changed everything. Hendricks had never reported Grace as missing or stolen. He had filed no police report, made no insurance claim, done nothing that would create an official record of his ownership. He had simply let her go, expecting her to disappear into the wilderness. It was only when he heard about the miracle foals that he had decided to reclaim what he had thrown away. The information Rebecca had uncovered changed everything. If Victor Hendricks had truly abandoned Grace, if he had made no effort to find her or report her missing, then his claim to ownership was standing on shaky ground. Eleanor felt hope kindle in her chest for the first time since the black truck had pulled into her yard. But she knew better than to let that hope make her careless. Men like Hendricks did not accept defeat gracefully, and the fact that he had sent his men to retrieve Grace suggested that he was willing to pursue this matter, regardless of the legal niceties. Rebecca advised Eleanor to be prepared for anything. She filed paperwork with the county, officially registering Eleanor as the caretaker of the 3 horses and documenting the circumstances of their arrival. She contacted animal welfare authorities to report her concerns about Grace's condition when she was found, creating an official record of the neglect the mare had suffered. She reached out to Dr. Chen, who provided a detailed veterinary statement describing the physical evidence of prior mistreatment and the exceptional care Eleanor had provided since taking the horses in. Meanwhile, Eleanor took steps of her own to protect her equine family. She reinforced the locks on the barn doors and installed a motion-activated light that would alert her to any nighttime visitors. Frank helped her set up a simple alarm system using wireless sensors he had purchased at the hardware store in town. It was not much, Eleanor knew, but it was something. It would give her warning if anyone tried to take Grace in the foals while she slept. The waiting was the hardest part. Days passed with no word from Hendricks or his representatives, and the silence felt more ominous than any direct confrontation would have been. Eleanor found herself jumping at every unfamiliar sound, peering out windows at every passing vehicle, lying awake at night listening for footsteps that never came. The stress began to take its toll on her health, her appetite diminishing, and her sleep becoming fragmented and filled with anxious dreams. But even in her darkest moments, the horses provided comfort. Eleanor would sit in the barn for hours, watching Grace graze peacefully, while Shepherd and Hope played their endless games of chase and mock battle. The foals had developed distinct personalities now, Shepherd bold and adventurous, always the first to investigate anything new, and Hope more cautious and gentle, preferring to stay close to her mother's side. Watching them grow and thrive, knowing that she had played a part in their survival, gave Eleanor a sense of purpose that transcended her fear. It was on a crisp April morning, with the last of the snow finally melted and the first green shoots pushing through the brown earth, that the confrontation finally came. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard not one but several vehicles approaching. She rushed to the window and felt her heart sink at the sight before her. The black truck had returned, but this time it was accompanied by a sleek silver sedan and a large horse trailer that spoke of serious intentions. Eleanor called Frank immediately, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she now knew by heart. She called Rebecca next, leaving a frantic message when the lawyer did not answer. Then she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out to meet whatever was coming. She would not cower inside her house while strangers threatened what was hers. She would face them with the dignity that 73 years of hard living had taught her. Marcus Webb emerged from the black truck, but this time he was not the one in charge. From the silver sedan stepped a man Eleanor had never seen before but recognized instantly from Rebecca's descriptions. Victor Hendricks was tall and immaculately dressed, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face bearing the smooth confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. He looked at Eleanor's modest farmhouse, at her worn clothes and weathered face, with an expression of barely concealed contempt. He introduced himself with a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He complimented her farm, her dedication, her obvious love for animals. He expressed gratitude for the care she had given to his horse during her unfortunate adventure. And then, his voice hardening beneath the veneer of civility, he informed her that he had come to collect what belonged to him. His lawyers had prepared the necessary documents. His trailer was ready to transport the mare and her foals. He was willing to compensate Eleanor for her trouble, a generous sum that he was certain would be welcome given her obvious circumstances. Eleanor listened to him speak, feeling her fear slowly transform into anger. This man stood before her, offering money as if that could erase the suffering he had caused, as if Grace's terror and the twins' miraculous survival were nothing more than an inconvenience to be settled with a check. He had thrown Grace away like garbage, had left her to die in the wilderness, and now he wanted to reclaim her because her foals might be worth something. The arrogance of it took Eleanor's breath away. She told him no. The word came out quiet but firm, and she saw surprise flicker across Hendrix's face as if the possibility of refusal had never occurred to him. She told him that Grace and her foals were not for sale, were not his to take, were not property to be discarded and reclaimed at will. She told him that she knew what he had done, how he had abandoned a pregnant mare to die, and that she would fight him with everything she had before she would let him take these horses back to wherever they had suffered before. Hendrix's expression darkened, the mask of civility slipping to reveal the ruthlessness beneath. He told her that she was making a serious mistake, that she was an old woman alone against resources she could not imagine, that her stubbornness would only make things worse for her in the end. He gestured toward the men standing by the trailer, their presence a silent threat that needed no words to communicate its meaning. But before Eleanor could respond, another vehicle appeared on the road, then another, and another. Within minutes, her yard was filling with trucks and cars, with neighbors and friends who had been watching and waiting for this moment. Frank was there, and Dr. Chen, and Rebecca Torres, and dozens of others whose faces Eleanor recognized from church and town and years of living in this community. They stood behind her, around her, a wall of support that Hendrix had never anticipated. The sight of so many people gathered in her defense brought tears to Eleanor's eyes that she quickly blinked away. She would not show weakness in front of this man who had caused so much suffering. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she drew strength from the presence of her community, from the knowledge that she was not alone, that her fight had become their fight, in a way that transcended the legal questions of ownership and property. Victor Hendrix surveyed the crowd with narrowed eyes, his calculating mind clearly reassessing the situation. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated a quick and easy retrieval, an old woman too weak and isolated to offer any meaningful resistance. Instead, he found himself facing a small army of farmers and townsfolk, their expressions making clear that they would not stand idly by while he took what he had come for. For the first time since his arrival, uncertainty flickered across his confident features. Rebecca Torres stepped forward, her posture radiating professional authority despite her modest appearance. She introduced herself as Eleanor's legal representative and informed Hendrix that any attempt to remove the horses from the property would be considered theft under Minnesota law. She cited the statutes regarding abandoned animals, the documentation she had filed with the county, the veterinary reports detailing Grace's condition upon arrival. She spoke clearly and precisely, each word a brick in the wall she was building between Hendrix and his intended prey. Hendrix listened with growing irritation, his jaw tightening as Rebecca methodically dismantled his assumptions of easy victory. When she finished, he turned to Marcus Webb and spoke in a low voice that Eleanor could not hear. Webb nodded and retreated to the black truck, returning moments later with a folder of documents that he thrust toward Rebecca with barely concealed hostility. These, Hendrix declared, proved beyond any doubt that the mare belonged to him: bills of sale, registration papers, veterinary records from his own facility. Surely this settled the matter. Rebecca took the folder and examined its contents with careful attention. The crowd waited in tense silence, even the spring birds seeming to hold their breath as she turned page after page. When she finally looked up, There was a glint in her eye that made Eleanor's heart leap with hope. These documents, Rebecca observed, proved that Hendricks had once owned a mare matching Grace's description. What they did not prove was that he still owned her at the time she appeared at Eleanor's farm. She pointed out the date on the most recent veterinary record, more than 6 months before the blizzard that had brought Grace to Eleanor's door. She noted the absence of any police report, any insurance claim, any documentation whatsoever indicating that Hendricks had attempted to locate or recover a supposedly valuable pregnant mare. She suggested that the evidence pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Victor Hendricks had abandoned Grace, had deliberately released her, or allowed her to escape without making any effort to find her, and had only developed renewed interest in her when he learned of the valuable twin foals she had produced. The murmur that went through the crowd at Rebecca's words was like the rumble of distant thunder. These were people who lived close to the land, who understood the sacred bond between humans and the animals in their care. The idea that someone would throw away a living creature as casually as a broken tool offended them on a level that went beyond mere disapproval. They looked at Hendricks with eyes that held judgment, with expressions that made clear what they thought of a man who would do such a thing. Hendricks felt the tide turning against him and made one last attempt to salvage the situation. He raised his voice, addressing the crowd directly, appealing to their sense of law and order. He was the legal owner of this horse, he insisted. The fact that he had not actively searched for her did not change that fundamental reality. Property was property, and the law was the law. If they prevented him from exercising his rights, they would all be liable for the consequences. It was Frank Peterson who responded, his voice carrying the weight of 6 decades of living and working in this community. He told Hendricks that they knew all about legal rights in these parts. They also knew about moral rights, about the obligations that came with caring for living creatures, about the difference between owning something and deserving it. Eleanor had earned her claim to Grace and those foals through weeks of love and labor. What had Hendricks done to deserve them except throw them away? A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled neighbors. Someone called out that Hendricks should be ashamed of himself. Another voice suggested that he should leave before he embarrassed himself further. The mood was turning hostile, and even Marcus Webb seemed to recognize that the situation was slipping beyond their control. He touched Hendricks's arm and spoke urgently in his ear, clearly advising retreat. For a long moment, Hendricks stood motionless, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Eleanor could see him weighing his options, calculating the costs and benefits of pressing forward against the opposition he faced. She held her breath, waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Then, with a visible effort, Hendricks forced his expression into something resembling composure. He announced that he would not lower himself to brawling with farmers. His lawyers would handle this matter through proper channels. Eleanor would be hearing from them soon. He turned and walked back to his silver sedan, his spine rigid with wounded pride. Marcus Webb and the other men followed, their eyes avoiding the gazes of the crowd as they retreated to their vehicles. The horse trailer, empty as it had arrived, rumbled out of the yard behind them. Within minutes, the convoy had disappeared down the road, leaving only settling dust to mark their passage. The moment they were gone, Eleanor felt her legs begin to tremble. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving behind an exhaustion that seemed to reach into her very bones. But before she could collapse, hands were there to steady her. Frank on one side, Rebecca on the other, and behind them a community that had proven itself in ways that would never be forgotten. Someone suggested they all go to the barn to check on the horses. Eleanor nodded gratefully, allowing herself to be guided toward the structure that had become the center of her world. As they walked, neighbors patted her shoulder, squeezed her hand, offered words of encouragement and support. She had lived in this community for more than 50 years, but never until this moment had she truly understood what that meant. These people were not just neighbors, They were family. The weeks that followed Victor Hendricks's departure from Eleanor's farm were filled with legal maneuvering and anxious waiting. True to his word, Hendricks had his lawyers send a formal demand for the return of the horses, threatening civil action if Eleanor did not comply. Rebecca Torres responded with equal formality, outlining the case for abandonment and requesting documentation that Hendricks could not provide. Letters flew back and forth, each side probing for weaknesses in the other's position, while Eleanor tried to maintain her daily routines despite the uncertainty that hung over everything. But as spring blossomed into early summer, the letters from Hendricks's lawyers became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. Rebecca explained that this was not unusual in such cases. Men like Hendricks were accustomed to easy victories, to opponents who folded at the first sign of resistance. When faced with a genuine fight with the prospect of public exposure and the scrutiny of their actions, they often chose to cut their losses and move on to easier targets. Grace and her foals, it seemed, were no longer worth the trouble. The official confirmation came in late June, a brief letter from Rebecca informing Eleanor that Hendricks had formally relinquished any claim to the horses. There would be no lawsuit, no further attempts to reclaim what he had thrown away. Grace, Shepard, and Hope belonged to Eleanor now, legally and irrevocably. When she finished reading the letter, Eleanor sat down heavily in her kitchen chair and wept with relief. The battle was over. Her family was safe. Summer brought long, golden days that Eleanor spent almost entirely with her horses. Shepard and Hope had grown into beautiful young animals, their cream-colored coats gleaming in the sunlight as they raced across the paddock that Eleanor had expanded with Frank's help. Grace watched over them with patient maternal pride, her own coat now thick and lustrous, her eyes holding none of the fear that had haunted them when she first collapsed at Eleanor's door. The transformation was remarkable, a testament to what love and proper care could accomplish. Eleanor's own transformation was equally profound. The woman who had spent years slowly fading into isolation and despair had been reborn through the simple act of caring for another living being. She ate regular meals now, slept soundly through the night, woke each morning with purpose and anticipation. Her children noticed the change during their summer visits, both Sarah and Michael commenting with wonder and gratitude on how their mother had come back to life. They thanked Grace silently for the miracle she had worked, for giving them back a mother they had feared was lost. The story of the miracle mare and her twin foals spread far beyond the small Minnesota community where it had unfolded. A local newspaper ran a feature about Eleanor and her horses, and the story was picked up by larger outlets hungry for tales of hope and redemption. Letters arrived from across the country, from people who had been touched by the account of an old woman and a desperate horse finding each other in a blizzard. Some sent donations to help with the horses' care. Others simply wanted to share their own stories of animals who had changed their lives. Eleanor read every letter and responded to as many as she could, her arthritic hands cramping from the unaccustomed effort of writing. She understood now that her story was not really about her at all. It was about the connections that sustain us, the unexpected gifts that arrive when we need them most, the capacity for love that exists in all living things. Grace had not simply appeared at her door by chance. She had been sent, Eleanor believed, by a providence that knew exactly what both of them needed. As autumn approached and the leaves began their annual transformation from green to gold, Eleanor often found herself sitting in the barn at twilight, watching Grace and the foals settle in for the night. She would remember that first terrible evening, the blizzard howling outside, the pregnant mare collapsed and dying on her porch. She would remember the fear and exhaustion of those early days, the uncertainty of whether any of them would survive. And she would marvel at how far they had all come since then. Frank Peterson became a regular fixture at the farm, his visits growing longer and more frequent as the months passed. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his arrival, enjoying his quiet company and the comfortable silences they shared while watching the horses graze. Neither of them spoke of what might be developing between them, but both understood that something had shifted. After years of solitude, they had found in each other a companionship that neither had expected to experience again. On the one-year anniversary of the blizzard that had brought Grace into her life, Eleanor hosted a gathering at her farm. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, filling her yard with laughter and conversation. There was food enough for an army, much of it brought by guests who remembered how Eleanor had been fed by the community during those difficult early months. Children ran through the paddock under Grace's watchful eye, while Shepherd and Hope showed off for their audience with the natural showmanship of youth. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Eleanor stood at the edge of the paddock and watched the scene before her. Grace ambled over to stand beside her, the mare's warm breath soft against Eleanor's weathered cheek. For a long moment neither moved, woman and horse sharing a silence that held more meaning than words could express. Then Eleanor reached up and wrapped her arms around Grace's neck, burying her face in the familiar warmth of her coat. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for finding me." Grace nickered softly in response, and Eleanor could have sworn she understood. Perhaps she did. Perhaps the bond between them transcended the limitations of language and species. Perhaps love, in its purest form, needed no translation. As Eleanor walked back toward the gathering, toward the friends and family who had become her strength, she carried with her a truth that the past year had taught her. Life, even at its darkest, held the possibility of miracles. And sometimes, those miracles arrived on four legs, in the middle of a blizzard, when you least expected them, but needed them most. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and leave a comment below telling us how it touched your heart. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another inspiring tale of love and loyalty between humans and animals. And remember, sometimes the greatest blessings come to us in the most unexpected ways.